poverty?
I feel like there should be a solution. Like, if it's community based, the community should come together and find a solution to help those in poverty, and not just like leave them out and like fend for themselves.
Yeah. It's a struggle, honestly. Yeah. You know.
Who do you think suffers more, people in rural areas or urban areas?
People from urban areas, because it's just it's a big city and big place that they don't have a community to support, pretty much.
I'd say.
And people not that much people are kind enough to give money and be generous. Yeah.
I'd say urban as well, but also like rural areas is just as tough because they're not going to be putting like a American Red Cross right in the middle of like Kennett Square or something, because that's just going to like attract like more or less of a homeless like type of poverty type But no, urban area is definitely tougher because it's just a huge city and it's tough.
About how much of the U.S. do you think suffers from poverty?
Oh wow.
Hang on.
Damn.
Disrespectful.
What's that?
Wow, that's a big question.
Edit that.
About how many children do you think suffer from poverty?
Like we talking like you want like a number?
I
Do you
mean,
want, like,
based on the other statistic,
Yeah, I'd say 10 million.
I'd say like 18.
35.
15 million.
I was close. We were close to that. We were both close. They're not gonna see a kid on the street. That's just cool.
About how much of the U.S. do you think suffers from poverty?
If I had to say, maybe 10 million, maybe more.
45 million.
Wow. Yo.
Is it at all?
What are some of your opinions in a solution to poverty?
There should be more communities and
More food drives.
more food drives. Yes, like there should be people coming together to help the less fortunate, because everybody sort of has their down days, and yeah, there should be some way to help them.
I said we just like let's just make everything free. Let's just make everything free, and like we'd be able to get elected.
What do you think about rural poverty?
Well, I don't know that much about rural poverty because I've never lived in a rural area before. What I do know, however, is that often when we think of poverty, we think of urban areas, right? Cities that are under siege. So I think that we're not often, very understanding, or we don't really recognize that it is a problem. And in fact, as you know from your research, it truly is a big problem in the United States. And I think the hard thing for people who live in rural areas is because they're so spread out and because they don't tend to be concentrated because they're rural in more urban areas, that it's harder to get services to them because you don't have a lot of poor people in one area as you do in a city, but you have poor people spread out. So that I think it's hard for people who are poor who live in rural areas.
Who do you think suffers more, people in rural areas or urban areas?
That's a good question. I think to be poor and to not have enough to eat and not to be able to take care of yourself and your family is stressful. I mean, I think people who are poor live with constant stress, which is just very awful. I think whether you're poor in the city or if you're poor in the country, or rural areas, it's very hard. 25% of American children live in poverty, and that's just unacceptable to me. However, I do think that, as I said when I started, that because so many poor people are concentrated in the cities and because there are social services available to them and public transportation, I think maybe it's a little bit easier to be poor in the city versus in the country, because if you're poor in the country and you can't afford transportation, well, generally in rural areas there isn't public transportation. So I think for those reasons it might be more challenging in that regard.
About how much of the U.S. do you think suffers from poverty?
Well, I know it's 25% of children in America live below the poverty line, and I know there's deep poverty, and I forget what the percentages are. So I'm going to say, 15 to 20%? Is that about right?
14.5.
All right.
14.5. What are some of your opinions and solutions to rural poverty?
Boy, that's a hard one. I think just in general, some solutions, whether you're poor in the country, in rural or in urban areas, is a lot of people are poor because they don't have employment, right? Or they don't have enough employment. So what do you do to solve that? One is to provide training to people. So if you're in a rural area and the factory that everybody worked in closed down, what else can you train people to do? Because if there's no training for them to get new jobs, then they can't not be poor, right? The other thing is you need to provide them with a support network, and by that I mean transportation. I mean childcare. So if I live in an area and there's no public transportation and there's no childcare and there are no jobs, you know, people can't just move to other areas, right? I mean, I think if there are areas that are that depressed and there are job opportunities elsewhere, then you have to help people reestablish. I mean, if you have no money, you can't just say, all right, I'm going to get in the car and go get an apartment somewhere else. I mean, that's just not realistic. So I think if we are truly serious as a society, if we really want to help our fellow Americans, then we need to say, all right, we'll help people get reestablished. We'll provide them with training. We'll provide them with child care. We'll provide transportation for them. Because if we don't do that, then that doesn't do anything to help create the root problem, which then results in poverty.